Welcome back to Sissy Maya. Make sure to subscribe to our channel to never miss an update. Additionally, consider subscribing to my Patreon to get access to these features, and much more. It was a hot summer day in the small town of Willowbrook. The kind of day where the sun beats down on everything, making the air shimmer and dance. Jake, a tall, lanky 18-year-old boy, had just finished his shift at the local gas station. He was looking forward to a long, lazy afternoon, maybe even a swim in the creek that ran behind his house. As he walked down the road towards his house, he couldn't help but notice the curtains blowing in the breeze in Mrs. Henderson's house across the street. Mrs. Henderson was a tall, imposing woman in her late 40s, with a no-nonsense attitude and a sharp tongue. Jake had always been a little afraid of her, but he couldn't deny that she was also incredibly attractive. He knew he shouldn't, but he couldn't help himself. He crept closer to her house, peering through the windows to catch a glimpse of her. And that's when he saw her, changing her clothes in her bedroom. He felt a surge of excitement and shame as he watched her, but he couldn't tear his eyes away. Suddenly, he heard a loud noise behind him. He turned around to see Mrs. Henderson standing in her front yard, glaring at him. "What the hell do you think you're doing, Jake?" she demanded. Jake's heart raced as he tried to come up with an excuse, but he knew there was none. Mrs. Henderson strode towards him, her eyes blazing with anger. "You're a pervert, Jake," she spat. "And you're going to pay for what you've done." Before Jake knew what was happening, Mrs. Henderson had grabbed him by the arm and dragged him into her house. She pushed him into her living room, where a large group of neighbors had gathered. Jake's face burned with shame as he realized that they had all seen him spying on Mrs. Henderson. "This boy has been sneaking into my house and spying on me," Mrs. Henderson announced to the crowd. "And I'm not going to stand for it." She turned to Jake, her eyes cold and hard. "You're going to be punished, Jake," she said. "And you're going to be punished publicly." Jake's heart sank as he realized the horror of what was about to happen. He had never felt so humiliated, so ashamed. And he knew that his life would never be the same again. Mrs. Henderson pulled out a long, flowing dress from her closet and threw it at Jake. "Put this on," she ordered. "And you're going to wear it in front of everyone." Jake hesitated, but he knew he had no choice. He took the dress and started to put it on, his hands shaking with fear. The dress was tight and feminine, with lace and frills in all the right places. Jake felt like he was being suffocated, like he was losing himself. Mrs. Henderson turned to the crowd, a smug smile on her face. "Look at him," she said. "A pathetic little boy, dressed up like a girl. This is what happens to perverts." Jake felt like he was going to throw up, like he was going to die of shame. He couldn't believe what was happening to him, couldn't believe that his life had taken such a terrible turn. But he knew that he had no choice. Jake stood in front of the crowd, his heart racing with fear and humiliation. He couldn't believe what was happening to him, couldn't believe that he was being forced to wear a dress in front of everyone. Mrs. Henderson stood in front of him, a smug smile on her face. "You're going to stand there for the next hour," she said. "And you're going to answer any questions anyone has for you." Jake felt like he was going to pass out, like he was going to die of shame. He couldn't imagine having to stand there, dressed up like a girl, while everyone stared at him. The questions started almost immediately. "Why are you wearing a dress, Jake?" one of the neighbors asked. Jake felt his face burning with shame. "I was caught spying on Mrs. Henderson," he mumbled. "And what were you doing when you were spying on her?" another neighbor asked. Jake felt like he was going to throw up. "I was looking at her while she was changing her clothes," he admitted. "And why were you spying on her?" the first neighbor asked. Jake felt like he was going to break down in tears. "I don't know," he said. "I just couldn't help myself." Mrs. Henderson stepped forward, a hard look in her eyes. "This boy needs to be taught a lesson," she said. "A lesson in respect and boundaries." She turned to Jake, her voice cold and hard. "You're going to be punished, Jake," she said. "And you're going to be punished publicly." Jake felt like he was going to faint, like he was going to die of shame. He couldn't believe what was happening to him, couldn't believe that his life had taken such a terrible turn. Mrs. Henderson walked over to a large table in the corner of the room. She picked up a long, thin whip and cracked it against the table. "Bend over, Jake," she ordered. Jake felt like he was going to throw up, like he was going to die of fear. He couldn't believe that Mrs. Henderson was going to whip him, couldn't believe that he was going to be punished in front of everyone. But he knew that he had no choice. He bent over the table, his heart racing as he felt the whip come down on his bare legs. He cried out in pain, tears streaming down his face. Mrs. Henderson whipped him again and again, each stroke harder than the last. Jake felt like he was going to break, like he was going to die of pain. But he knew that he deserved it, knew that he had done something terrible. He closed his eyes and took the punishment, his mind numb with shame and fear. When it was finally over, Jake stood up, his legs shaking with pain. He felt like he was going to fall over, like he was going to pass out. Mrs. Henderson turned to the crowd, a satisfied look on her face. "That's what happens to perverts," she said. "They deserve to be punished, publicly and severely." Jake felt like he was going to cry, like he was going to die of shame. He couldn't believe what had happened to him, couldn't believe that his life had been destroyed in such a public and humiliating way. But he knew that he had brought it on himself, knew that he had deserved exactly that. Jake limped out of Mrs. Henderson's house, his legs still shaking from the whipping he had received. He felt like he was in a dream, like nothing was real. He couldn't believe what had happened to him, couldn't believe that he had been forced to wear a dress and be whipped in front of all his neighbors. He made his way home, tears streaming down his face. He locked himself in his room, collapsing on his bed. He couldn't stop shaking, couldn't stop crying. He didn't know how long he stayed there, lost in his own thoughts. He couldn't believe that he had done something so terrible, something that had ruined his life. He couldn't believe that he had deserved such a humiliating punishment. Finally, he got up and looked at himself in the mirror. He saw a stranger staring back at him, a boy in a dress, his legs covered in bruises from the whipping. He couldn't believe that it was him, couldn't believe that he had become this person. He took off the dress and threw it in the corner of the room. He couldn't bear to look at it, couldn't bear to remember what he had been forced to do. He sat down on his bed, his mind racing with questions. What was going to happen now? Was he going to be able to go back to his old life, to being a normal boy? Or was he going to be stuck in this nightmare forever? He didn't know the answers, but he knew one thing for sure. He had learned his lesson, had learned to respect other people's boundaries and to keep his desires in check. He vowed to never make the same mistake again, vowed to never let his desires get the best of him. He knew that he had a long, hard road ahead of him, but he was ready to face it. He took a deep breath and got up, ready to face the world again. He knew that it wouldn't be easy, but he was determined to make things right. He walked out of his room and down the stairs, his heart racing with fear. He knew that his neighbors would still be talking about what had happened, still be judging him and punishing him. But he was ready to face it, ready to show them that he had changed, ready to show them that he was a better person. He opened the front door and stepped out into the sun, ready to start his new life. Jake walked down the street, his head held high. He knew that he had made a mistake, but he also knew that he had learned from it. He was determined to show his neighbors that he had changed, that he was a better person. But it wasn't easy. Everywhere he went, people stared at him, whispered about him. He could feel their judgment, their disapproval. He knew that they still saw him as a pervert, as a boy who deserved to be punished. He tried to ignore it, tried to focus on his own thoughts. But it was hard. He couldn't help but feel like he was being suffocated, like he was trapped in a world that didn't want him. He made his way to the local grocery store, hoping to buy some food for dinner. But as he walked down the aisle, he heard a familiar voice. "Well, well, well," Mrs. Henderson said, a smug smile on her face. "Look who it is. The pervert boy." Jake felt his heart sink. He had hoped to avoid Mrs. Henderson, had hoped to never have to see her again. But here she was, right in front of him. "What do you want?" he asked, his voice cold and hard. "I just wanted to remind you of the lesson you learned," Mrs. Henderson said. "I wanted to remind you of the punishment you received." Jake felt his anger rising. He couldn't believe that Mrs. Henderson was still treating him like this, couldn't believe that she was still punishing him. "I've learned my lesson," he said. "I don't need you to remind me." "Oh, I think you do," Mrs. Henderson said. "I think you need to be reminded every day of what you did, of the shame you brought upon yourself." Jake felt like he was going to explode, like he was going to lose control. He couldn't believe that Mrs. Henderson was still treating him like this, couldn't believe that she was still punishing him. "Leave me alone," he said, his voice shaking with anger. "Just leave me alone." Mrs. Henderson laughed. "Fine," she said. "I'll leave you alone. For now." Jake walked away, his heart racing with anger and fear. He couldn't believe that Mrs. Henderson was still treating him like this, couldn't believe that she was still punishing him. He made his way home, his mind racing with thoughts. He knew that he had to find a way to make things right, had to find a way to show his neighbors that he had changed. But he didn't know how. He didn't know what to do. He felt like he was trapped, like he was stuck in this nightmare forever. He collapsed on his bed, tears streaming down his face. He didn't know what to do, didn't know how to make things right. But he knew one thing for sure. He couldn't give up, couldn't let Mrs. Henderson win. He had to find a way to fight back, had to find a way to show his neighbors that he was a better person. He closed his eyes and took a deep breath, determined to face the challenges ahead. He knew that it wouldn't be easy, but he was ready to fight. He was ready to show the world that he was a changed person, ready to show the world that he was a better man. Jake sat in his room, staring at the wall. He couldn't believe what had happened, couldn't believe that he had been punished so publicly and so harshly. He felt like his life was over, like he would never be able to go back to the way things were before. But then there was a knock on the door. Jake's heart raced as he wondered who it could be. He wasn't expecting anyone, wasn't expecting any visitors. He got up and opened the door, his heart sinking as he saw Mrs. Henderson standing there. He had hoped to never have to see her again, had hoped to never have to deal with her again. "Can I come in?" Mrs. Henderson asked, her voice soft and gentle. Jake hesitated, but he knew he had no choice. He stepped aside and let Mrs. Henderson enter his room. "I wanted to talk to you," Mrs. Henderson said, sitting down on his bed. "I wanted to apologize for what I did." Jake felt his anger rising. He couldn't believe that Mrs. Henderson was apologizing, couldn't believe that she was admitting that she had been wrong. "Why are you apologizing?" he asked, his voice cold and hard. "You punished me because I deserved it. You punished me because I was a pervert." Mrs. Henderson shook her head. "No," she said. "I punished you because I was angry, because I was hurt. But I realize now that I went too far, that I was too harsh." Jake felt his anger melting away, felt his heart softening. He couldn't believe that Mrs. Henderson was apologizing, couldn't believe that she was admitting that she had been wrong. "I'm sorry," Mrs. Henderson said, her voice filled with regret. "I'm so sorry for what I did to you." Jake felt tears coming to his eyes. He couldn't believe that Mrs. Henderson was apologizing, couldn't believe that she was showing him kindness and compassion. "It's okay," he said, his voice soft and gentle. "I forgive you." Mrs. Henderson smiled, a genuine smile of happiness and relief. "Thank you," she said. "Thank you for forgiving me." They sat in silence for a moment, both of them lost in their own thoughts. Jake couldn't believe what had happened, couldn't believe that Mrs. Henderson had apologized and shown him kindness. "I want to make it up to you," Mrs. Henderson said, breaking the silence. "I want to spend a night with you, to show you that I'm sorry." Jake felt his heart racing with excitement and fear. He couldn't believe what Mrs. Henderson was suggesting, couldn't believe that she wanted to spend a night with him. "Are you sure?" he asked, his voice shaking with emotion. Mrs. Henderson nodded. "Yes," she said. "I'm sure. I want to make it up to you, to show you that I'm sorry." Jake felt his heart swelling with gratitude and love. He couldn't believe what Mrs. Henderson was doing, couldn't believe that she was showing him such kindness and compassion. "Okay," he said, his voice soft and gentle. "Okay, I'd like that." Mrs. Henderson smiled, a genuine smile of happiness and joy. "Good," Jake and Mrs. Henderson sat on his bed, both of them nervous and excited. Jake couldn't believe what was happening, couldn't believe that Mrs. Henderson was going to spend the night with him. They sat in silence for a moment, both of them lost in their own thoughts. Jake couldn't help but feel a little scared, a little unsure of what was going to happen. But then Mrs. Henderson broke the silence. "Can I kiss you?" she asked, her voice soft and gentle. Jake felt his heart racing with excitement and fear. He couldn't believe that Mrs. Henderson was asking him for permission, couldn't believe that she was showing him such respect and consideration. "Yes," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Mrs. Henderson leaned forward and kissed him, her lips soft and gentle against his. Jake felt a surge of excitement and happiness, felt like he was floating on air. They kissed for a long time, their lips exploring each other's. Jake couldn't believe how good it felt, couldn't believe how much he had missed this. Finally, they broke the kiss, both of them breathless and dizzy. "That was nice," Mrs. Henderson said, her voice soft and gentle. Jake nodded, unable to speak. He couldn't believe what was happening, couldn't believe that Mrs. Henderson was showing him such kindness and compassion. They lay down on the bed, both of them cuddling close. Jake felt like he was in a dream, like nothing was real. He couldn't believe that he was here, lying in bed with Mrs. Henderson. They talked for a long time, both of them sharing their thoughts and feelings. Jake felt like he was getting to know Mrs. Henderson in a way he never had before, felt like he was seeing a side of her that he had never seen before. Finally, they fell asleep, both of them exhausted from the day's events. Jake felt like he was in a peaceful dream, like he was safe and protected. He woke up the next morning, feeling refreshed and rejuvenated. He couldn't believe what had happened, couldn't believe that he had spent the night with Mrs. Henderson. He got up and looked at her, still asleep on his bed. He felt a surge of love and affection, felt like he had never felt before. He leaned down and kissed her, her lips soft and gentle against his. She woke up with a smile, a genuine smile of happiness and joy. "Good morning," she said, her voice soft and gentle. "Good morning," Jake said, his voice filled with love and affection. They spent the rest of the morning together, both of them enjoying each other's company. Jake felt like he had found a new friend, a new ally in the world. Finally, it was time for Mrs. Henderson to leave. Jake walked her to the door, his heart heavy with sadness and regret. "Thank you for yesterday," Mrs. Henderson said, her voice soft and gentle. "Thank you for showing me kindness and compassion." Jake nodded, unable to speak. He couldn't believe what had happened, couldn't believe that Mrs. Henderson had apologized and shown him such kindness and compassion. "I'll see you soon," Mrs. Henderson said, her voice filled with hope and promise. Jake nodded, unable to speak. He couldn't wait to see Mrs. Henderson again. Jake went about his day, his mind filled with thoughts of Mrs. Henderson. He couldn't believe what had happened, couldn't believe that she had apologized and shown him such kindness and compassion. He felt like he had found a new friend, a new ally in the world. He felt like he had been given a second chance, a chance to start over and make things right. He threw himself into his work, determined to make the most of this opportunity. He worked harder than he ever had before, determined to show Mrs. Henderson that he was a changed person, determined to show her that he was a better man. And it seemed to work. People started treating him differently, started showing him respect and consideration. He could feel the change in the air, could feel the difference in the way people treated him. He knew that it wasn't all because of Mrs. Henderson. He knew that he had changed, that he had become a better person. But he also knew that Mrs. Henderson had played a big role in this change. He couldn't wait to see her again, couldn't wait to thank her for everything she had done for him. He knew that it wasn't going to be easy, knew that there were still going to be challenges and obstacles to overcome. But he was ready for them. He was ready to face whatever came his way, ready to show the world that he was a changed person, ready to show the world that he was a better man. He went to bed that night, feeling happy and content. He knew that he had found a new path in life, a path that led to happiness and fulfillment. And he knew that Mrs. Henderson was a big part of that path. He knew that she had played a big role in his transformation, knew that she had shown him kindness and compassion when he needed it most. He fell asleep with a smile on his face, a smile of happiness and contentment. He knew that he had found his place in the world, knew that he had found his purpose. And he knew that Mrs. Henderson was a big part of that purpose. He knew that she was a big part of his life, a big part of his heart. And he knew that he was grateful for her, grateful for everything she had done for him. He knew that he loved her with all his heart. And he knew that he was ready for whatever came next. He was ready to face the challenges and obstacles, ready to show the world that he was a changed person, ready to show the world that he was a better man. He was ready for a new beginning, a beginning that was filled with hope and promise. He was ready for a new life, a life that was filled with happiness and fulfillment. And he knew that Mrs. Henderson was a big part of that new life. He knew that she was a big part of his future, a big part of his heart. And he knew that he loved her with all his heart. But she was married, and he didn't want to come in the way of her and her husband, so he got over it and moved on with his life as a better, more mature human.